Hello, everyone. This is another session of Morning Jim Poetry. This is Jim Ransom, and I'm ready to go, and I hope you are too. Today we are going to do something or start something I haven't done much, and that is confine the program to just one poet, and that poet is Archibald MacLeish. He had a long career as a successful poet. I've done that before. And writer of other things. And I would say that he was one of the most lucky poets of the 20th century. And you'll see why in a little while. And he did a lot of other things besides write poems. But he started out with good genes and lots of luck. His father was a founder of the Carson Peary Scott department store in Chicago, and the family became quite wealthy while young Archibald was just a kid. His mother was a college professor and also a former president of Rockford College in Illinois. Of course, he attended a private school and went from there to, where else? Yale, where he majored in English and had just about every honor they could dish out at Yale. As far as I can tell, he never particularly made a play for an honor. They just came his way. He stumbled into them, and I think justifiably, because the guy was a genius. The guy never had any trouble getting things right, and he was very fortunate in that he lived when he did, and you'll see why as we go along here. When he graduated from Yale, he immediately joined the Army because the American portion of the Great War had just taken up, and he went in first as an ambulance driver, and then he was put forward as an artillery officer, and he served as an artillery officer in at least one major battle. His brother was killed in the Great War, but Archie came out unscathed, of course. In 1916, he got married, and he had a beautiful wife who was also very well educated. And in the ensuing years, he and his wife had 3 children. During this time, he enrolled in Harvard Law School. He seemed to want to become a lawyer, and he had a lot of encouragement to do so by members of his family. And naturally, he became editor of the Law Review. And then he went into the practice of law in Boston for several years. But all this time, he was getting more and more restless because he really wanted to be a writer. And there were no financial constraints on him. He had plenty of money. It was in the family. And he made a sizable amount of money as a lawyer in the years that he practiced. So, in 1923, he moved with his wife and kids to Paris, having decided on a career as a writer. Now, a huge coterie of American literary expatriates were there at that time, and he became part of a literary social salon organized by, who else? Gertrude Stein. Ernest Hemingway was one of those people, Ezra Pound, and numerous other poets and novelists and essayists, American expatriates, and really most of the writers of the next generation of American literati were in Paris at that time. So again, without having to do anything special on his own, he got in the middle of an amazing time in Paris. There was a wild and woolly gentleman who was also extremely wealthy, an American multimillionaire heir, whose name was Crosby, at that time. And he was able to sell some of his poetry to an expatriate press started by Crosby, and to several magazines. So without much effort, he went to Paris and became successful. Now let's stop here and read one of his best poems. This one's called And You, Andrew Marvell. You, Andrew Marvell. This is one of the first poems that really caught my attention as a young man going into college. And it tells a story that you might say is combines the course of civilizations from the past all in one. And it had the power to move me at that time into reading more and more poetry. You, Andrew Marvell. And here, face down beneath the sun, and here upon earth's noonward height, to feel the always coming on, the always rising of the night, to feel creep up the curving east, the earthy chill of dusk, and slow upon those underlands, the vast and ever-climbing shadow grow, and strange at Ecbatan, the trees take leaf by leaf, the evening, strange the flooding dark about their knees. The mountains over Persia change, and now at Kermanshah, the gate, dark, empty, and the withered grass, and through the twilight now, the late few travelers in the westward pass, and Baghdad darken, and the bridge across the silent river gone. And through Arabia, the edge of evening widen and steal on, and deepen on Palmyra's street, the wheel rut in the ruined stone, and Lebanon fade out, and Crete, high through the clouds and overblown, and over Sicily the air still flashing with the landward gulls, and loom, and slowly disappear the sails above the shadowy hulls, and Spain go under, and the shore of Africa, the gilded sand, and evening vanish, and no more the low, pale light across that land, nor now the long light on the sea. And here, face downward in the sun, to feel how swift, how secretly, the shadow of the night comes on. Now that's what I call a powerful poem, and I made some notes about it. That poem was written in 1930, so it was well after World War I. It was partly inspired by the Andrew Marvell Shakespearean era poem called To His Coy Mistress. So he meditates in the Coy Mistress poem, of course, which was probably his inspiration. Andrew Marvell was telling his mistress how fast time passes, so they better get together as lovers before it's too late. This poem takes a little bit more complex road than that. It's the meditation on the fall of civilization, condensed into a single night. You can see how he takes the sunset all through the ancient civilizations of the East and brings it to our present location. He begins his poem with his face down, looking away from the sun and down at the earth beneath him. The poem also begins with the word and the anaphora of and here, beginning the first two lines of the poem. A very, very clever technique. And even at noon with the sun directly above, one can feel the always coming on of the night. This is a variation of the old line, in the midst of life we are in death. In the heyday of a great civilization, we are nevertheless reminded that it will one day be crumbling into nothing. Let's hope that doesn't happen very soon. A few more comments on Archibald MacLeish. Over the course of a long life, MacLeish became many things. I'm not going to have time to tell you all the things this man did in his life. He was a playwright, and after coming back from his stay in Europe, he wanted his boys to be educated in America. He was a playwright, a librarian of the Library of Congress, who completely modernized and made the Library of Congress workable. He was appointed that by Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was a friend of his, as you might imagine. And then he was a government official appointed. He only did that for a year, but Roosevelt appointed him Secretary of State for Public Affairs, a new job further enlarging a government, which has not stopped since. He always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. I'm talking here about Archie MacLeish. In 1949, he became a professor of literature at Harvard, and after retirement, which was required of him in 1962, he then became a lecturer in poetry and literature at Amherst for another 4 years. He lived to be 89 years old at the time of his death. And during his entire life, he was writing poetry, publishing poetry, and doing an amazing number of other things which I don't have time to hear you and to tell you. And if you heard them, you, like me, would become very jealous of the life he led. But it's wonderful, and it probably could only happen here in America. Now we have time for one more poem in this reading, and it's one of his most famous poems. It's called Ars Poetica, The Art of Poetry. A poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit, dumb as old medallions to the thumb, silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs, leaving as the moon releases, twig by twig, the night-entangled trees, leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves, memory by memory, the mind, the mind. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. A poem should be equal to, not true. For all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf. For love, the leaning grasses, and two lights above the sea. A poem should not mean, but be. That's that's a very profound commentary, to say the least. And it's another one of my favorite MacLeish poems. A comment or two about this one. I've made some notes here. A poem should not mean but be. In other words, a poem should not enact what it means to say, rather than merely talking about it. This obviously ties in with what MacLeish says about a poem being mute, dumb, silent, and even wordless. He wants you to take the words of the poem and know what they mean without any explanation. So what I'm doing here to give you these little background notes is kind of cheating. Trust the poem, trust the words, and forget about needing anything else. I'd say this is a provocative and suggestive poem, and it's a piece of writing from the 20th century modernist school of poetry to which he belonged that leaves as many questions in its wake as it provides answers. So, if you still don't get the poem, get a copy and read it, and whatever you get out of it is what it is. There's so many poems that are like that, and I think we all, and I'm certainly including myself, are people who like to think that we can interpret down to the nth degree every line from every poem we read. No, that's not what is intended, and it seldom happens. Well, just to show you, or just to mention this, in that part of his life when he was writing some of these poems, he was also writing political treatises, straying far off the reservation he staked out with this last poem. And now, we can't get this man all in one session. So next week, I'll read more of his poetry. There's one in particular that I found in the New Yorker Book of Poems, which I think is absolutely great. So be back next week for that poem. I'll say goodbye now, and I hope you have a great week coming up.